Podcasting Q&A for November 13th, 2017. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast.com. Got a few good questions lined up to answer for this live podcasting Q&A about self-talking in an episode before the interview content, a question about podcast sponsorship, a question about some weird Audacity thing with leveling, and potentially your questions if you're watching this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at the Audacity2Podcast.com/live. That's when I do these live Q&As. They're on Facebook Live currently, and you can participate in the chat room over there to post your question, and I can get to it during these live Q&As. And if you want to ask your question ahead of time to be added to this queue, then go to the Audacity2Podcast.com/feedback and send me a question through the website. And you can also email directly through there as well. And that can then be added to the queue for upcoming questions and answers. So the first question comes from Nancy Bose saying, I'd love to know how much of me talking content to put before the interview or after. If you're doing an interview style podcast, it really depends on what the main content is from that episode. Is the interview the main content? Is your perspective on the interview? It's not going to always be one way or the other. You are the curator of content in your podcast. So although you may be interviewing someone for every single episode, people are coming to the content to your podcast because of you, not always because of your guests. I look at people like John Lee Dumas. He asks the same questions of every guest, and he's had almost 2,000 guests on his podcast. Same questions over and over and over. Now, those are questions he has decided that he wants to answer, and his audience wants to hear the content he is curating from those conversations. They're not always listening to hear that guest. They're listening to hear the content that John pulls out from that interview. So, even though you may feel like your guest is the expert, your guest is the hook for your content, you are the hook. You are who your audience is coming for. Your audience trusts you to bring out good content. So whether that content is coming through the interview or it's coming through your own talking, it's still content, and it's content that your audience wants. Now, if you start a podcast and the main focus of that podcast is, or an episode, and the main focus is that interview, you definitely want to get to that as quickly as possible. But if the content you're wanting to share, the quote, me talking, unquote, that you mentioned is relevant content too. It's not merely calls to action or announcements or anything like that. It's not small talk either, but it's valuable content. You can put that wherever you want it. Because you look at all kinds of other forms of entertainment where they mix multiple things together. They put content up front, they put content in the middle, content at the end. And sometimes they give you their best content up front. Sometimes they give you their best content later on. But the main point is they're delivering content along the way. So for you, if your interview is the main focus of the episode, it's okay for you to do some me talking before the interview. If your talking is bringing out content that people can look for, or it's content about your guest, or it's some kind of application or what you thought of the interview, that could make sense. Now, keep in mind, you might be recording that content after you're having already heard the interview and you've done it. So don't talk about the content as if it's already passed. Talk about it as if it's coming, which it would be to your audience then. If the me talking content is not talking about what your guest talks about, that can still be fine in either the position before the interview or after the interview. It's really about what works best for you, what delivers that content to your audience. Now, if that content, the me talking part, is your calls to action, your announcements, some small talk, anything like that, I suggest moving that to the end and not having it at the beginning. Try to get into good, unique content as quickly as possible, whether that's you talking or it's your guest. And even when the episode's focus is on your guest, your audience still wants to hear from you and how you set up their expectations. will then determine what kind of freedoms you have with your episode without offending your audience. If you let them know, later in this episode, I'll have such and such on as a guest. Before I do that, I want to share this with you. That's okay. They've set their expectations. But if you start off the episode saying, today, I've got a fantastic interview with you about such and such, and this is so much value, let's jump right into it. But before we do, let's do this other thing first. There's actually a podcast I listen to. I won't call it out by name, but I've contacted the podcaster about this, and they just said, thanks for your feedback. They never changed anything. But their podcast, in the podcast, they say, let's get into it, or something like that, where basically they're saying, let's jump right into the content, and then they don't. Then they jump into a couple ads, and then they jump into the content. So you have to watch your language there. If they just dropped that line, didn't even say, let's jump into the content, then it would be more acceptable, I think, for them to jump into the ads. But saying, let's jump into the content, but first, this word from our sponsors. That's not jumping into the content then. So you are the curator of content for your audience, whether that content is coming from you or from your guest, and you can put that valuable content wherever you want to put it inside of your episode. Mateo Costa said that he was reading an article of mine, show notes, about podcast sponsorship, found it very useful, and he was wondering if I had any data or statistics about what the average conversion rate from an ad would be from a podcast. And this is difficult because it depends on a lot of things. First and foremost, I think what affects the conversion rate is relevance. I talk about this a lot. And while it's true that something may be relevant to you as a person and to your audience as people, to put it in your podcast won't make much sense. I wear shoes. You probably wear shoes too. So for me to have a sponsor, a shoe company sponsor, yes, it appeals to both of us, but it doesn't make much sense in my content. So if I put a shoe sponsor as the sponsor, or a shoe company as the sponsor in my podcast about podcasting, I'm probably not going to have a very high conversion rate because it doesn't matter that much to my audience. But if I put in a sponsor that does matter to my audience and to my content, then the conversion rate will probably be much higher, especially if that sponsor is even relevant to the content of that specific episode. For example, I've done episodes before where I've talked about WordPress themes for podcasters. And in the course of that episode, I recommend some themes that some of them have affiliate links with them. Those themes that I've recommended have done really well in the affiliate program. And they weren't sponsors. I wasn't being paid to mention them. I only get paid if you actually buy through my affiliate link. So it's a different kind of relationship than a sponsorship. And because it was woven into the content of the episode, it was totally relevant to the theme of my show, WordPress themes for podcasters, and it was totally relevant to that specific episode, which was all about WordPress themes for podcasters. Same thing like with microphones. If I were to say, this episode is brought to you by the Electro Voice RE320, it's a great podcasting microphone. Now, that might stand out to you if it's an episode about podcasting, and I happen to have that episode sponsored by a microphone. You might think, oh, that's interesting, and you might check it out. But you'd be far more likely to check it out if my entire episode is about microphones. And then I say, this episode is sponsored by the Electro Voice RE320. It is my favorite microphone. And then I talk about other microphones as well, but I keep bringing it back to this one microphone as being the one I recommend and the sponsor of the episode. Or maybe it's even just an affiliate link. That's much more relevant. So bringing it back to your actual question, the averages, I hear people say things like 5% or 10% actually take action on that ad. But I've heard other statistics from people like Lou Mongello, who hosts WDW Radio. This guy has collected podcast awards for years. He has a fantastic audience, fantastic connection with his audience, fantastic podcast too. He's been doing this since 2005, maybe even since 2004. So really old school podcaster, doing really well, engaging with his audience really well. And what he's been able to show, though, is not merely that conversion rate period, like for one particular sponsor. But he has been able to show that I think the number was somewhere around either 76 or maybe it was 92%, but it was some really high, very lucrative number that he said this really large number. Basically, the majority of his audience has purchased something that he has recommended, has purchased one of his sponsors that are relevant sponsors. That's a very impressive number. Now, that doesn't mean a single sponsor will get a 92% conversion rate, but it does mean that people will buy, and especially his audience will buy, when that thing is relevant to them. So that's what matters more than the pure average conversion rate, but that average conversion rate is going to be probably 1 to 5%, depending on the relevance, and other factors too. Like if you have the podcast for children and you're selling a $1,000 product to children, you'll probably have a 0% conversion rate. But if you're selling, and it can work the other way around, if you have a podcast for CEOs of companies and you're selling a $5 product, you also might not have conversion rates because it's about the value and about the relevance. But that average, somewhere around 1 to 5%. If you're above that, that's fantastic. It's kind of like open rates on emails as well. Although there is maybe an industry standard open rate of something like 25%, 20%, depends on the industry really. If you have something better than that, then that's great. You're above average, but above average for that whole industry. What matters more is what is your average with your audience, not the industry, but your audience and your connection with them. Next question from Jessica, talking about an issue with Audacity and normalizing audio in it. And she said, I have a question regarding the length of the audio being normalized. Why is the segment louder if they are the same settings, if it's even the same audio? So what she was doing is she had a longer portion of audio that she selected and she ran through the normalize feature in Audacity. Then she selected a shorter portion of the audio and normalized that, and it made that shorter portion much louder than it made the entire portion. The reason for that is because normalize as a tool is really not all that helpful, almost at all. Because most of the time when you see a normalize tool, whether it be in Audacity, Adobe Audition, ProLogic, Hindenburg, anything pretty much, normalization is usually based on peaks. It's peak normalization. So what it will do is it will look at the entire audio track and raise or lower the volume so that the loudest point in the audio track is no louder than a certain level. That's peak normalization. So then it's changing everything based on that loud spot. So the problem with this is, imagine that your entire audio track is very quiet and you're whispering the whole time. And at one moment you laugh and get really loud. Well, if you normalize that entire track, it will normalize it based on that loud point. And so thus your quiet points will be too quiet and your loud point might be at just the right volume. So what's happening if you select a smaller portion is the peaks in that smaller portion are probably not as high as peaks in other portions of the audio. So if you've selected a 2-second portion, it could end up being significantly louder than if you selected the 10-second portion and normalize it, because it's looking only at the peaks. That's why peak normalization is really almost worthless. And in podcasting, we have a loudness normalization standard. Loudness normalization is based on perceived loudness of audio. And there are certain algorithms that measure that. The basic unit of measurement is loudness units. And we speak in terms of how loud the audio is, long-term audio level, in LUFS, L-U-F-S. And so we would say it's -16 LUFS for stereo or -19 LUFS for mono. That's not taking into consideration those peaks. It's looking at the long term, the actual perceived loudness level of the audio. And so then if you were to select a short clip and loudness normalize it with something like Aphonic or Adobe Audition's match loudness tool, which used to be called match volume, or if you use Hindenburg's little tools, it will normalize it so that the loudness of that clip, the perceived loudness, is to that standard. Thus, if you select a small clip or a large clip, it should give you close to about the same results. That's loudness normalization that's built into those more advanced tools. Whereas peak normalization, which is what you see normally when you see a normalization tool inside of an app, peak normalization looks only at those loudest points and adjusts everything else based on the loudest points. It's a difference between the average. Average is not really the best word to use, but it's kind of like an average versus changing everything based on one issue. So thank you for the question, Jessica. Really appreciate that. Next episode of the Audacity to Podcast will be how you can work with other podcasters. I see this often in podcasting communities and such, where podcasters can sometimes be unfriendly to others, or they'll see others as competition, or they'll disrespect others. So this next episode of the Audacity to Podcast, publishing on November 14th, will be how you can work with other podcasters, avoiding that thought of or that approach of competition and respecting each other and ensuring that you're treating each other kindly. And there are some things in there that I've actually been guilty of before that I'm trying to keep myself from falling into certain traps of basically feeding my inner troll. And then, so after setting that premise of how to work with other podcasters and basically built around the idea of respect, then the next episode of the Audacity to Podcast, which will publish the following week, will be a very controversial episode for me. One of my most controversials, not because it's talking about a moral issue, but it's talking about an issue a lot of people are talking about in podcasting, and that is publishing audio podcasts to YouTube. And that episode will be why you shouldn't do that. If you care about YouTube, that is. If you don't care about YouTube, then go ahead and publish your fake videos. That's a basic conclusion from there. But if you want to learn why you shouldn't publish fake videos to YouTube and why that could actually hurt you more than help you, then watch for that episode. That will be episode 332 from the Audacity to Podcast, publishing on November 21st. If you have any questions that you'd like me to answer in one of these podcasting Q&As, then please go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/feedback and send me a message through there. Keep your question concise, and that makes it easier to answer during these Q&As. And if you want to send along any screenshot or audio sample or something like that for your quick question, that will help in my answering of it. And then you can join me for these live podcasting Q&As Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching.